While in Nigeria, we see democracy in question. Well, as African nations navigate economic challenges, the meaning of democracy seems increasingly strained under governmental responses to citizen dissent. In Nigeria, a recent wave of protests against high inflation and the rising cost of living has led to the arrest of dozens, including minors, charged with severe crimes such as treason and public disturbance. The situation raises questions. Does this level of suppression align with democratic principles, or is it a reflection of an authoritarian approach to governance? Well, on November 4th, President Bola Tinubu ordered the release of all minors involved in this protest, likely responding to widespread public criticism and demands for fair treatment. This announcement, however, comes only after reports of excessive charges and harsh conditions, underscoring the government's strict stance on handling dissent. A total of 76 protesters faced felony charges, including some who collapsed in court due to exhaustion. Reports indicate that these youths aged 14 to 17 had been detained in distressing conditions, which led to national outrage and calls for their immediate release. The legal perspective, right to protest and expression. Well, Nigeria's constitution guarantees freedom of assembly and expression under Section 39 and 40. These rights are fundamental in a democratic state, yet the government's action appear to challenge the constitution, arresting protesters and subjecting them to severe charges, especially minors, may be seen as an overreach that contradicts these rights. Many human rights advocates argue that such arrest not only stifles democratic expression, but also reflects a disregard for the economic grievances fueling the protest. Furthermore, according to international law, particularly the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, which Nigeria ratified, peaceful assembly is a protected right. This means that unless protests escalate into violence or significant public disruption, detaining participants for expressing discontent is questionable. However, the Nigerian government has cited concerns over vandalism and public safety as a justification for this arrest. Instances of property destruction and clashes during some protests have been reported, giving authorities a possible legal basis for intervention under the Public Order Act. Now, a broader African context, looking at the suppression of dissent. Nigeria is not alone in facing accusations of stifling dissent. Across Africa, from Zimbabwe to Uganda, there is a growing trend of governmental crackdowns on protesters and critics, often justified by security concerns. While critics argue that this intensifies the narrative that democracy is part of Africa is increasingly fragile, with leaders prioritizing stability over citizens' right to voice their dissatisfaction. For instance, African nations like Uganda have employed heavy-handed measures against opposition groups, often citing national security. In some cases, protesters have faced fatal outcomes, intensifying international criticism. These actions prompt questions about the future of democratic rights across the continent as governments resort to repressive tactics to maintain control. We wonder, is the response proportionate? While there have been reports of vandalism in some Nigerian protests, the government's response, criminal charges with severe implications, may be disproportionate. While critics contend that a balanced approach would involve investigating specific instances of violence without broadly criminalizing dissent. In a democracy, the right to protest is a crucial tool for citizens to communicate their concerns to the government, especially in matters of economic hardship. While there is a need for democratic accountability. The release of minors by presidential directive in Nigeria, although a step forward, does not fully address the broader issue of how Nigeria's government handles dissent. Democratic values are built on the premise of accountability and responsiveness to public grievances. A sustained crackdown on protesters, especially those advocating against hardship, undermines these principles and further alienates citizens from their leaders. If Nigeria and other African nations are to uphold democratic democratic values, they must adopt more constructive responses to protest, acknowledging economic frustrations while maintaining public order. Instead of harsh penalties, governments should seek dialogue and reform as ways to bridge the gap between state policies and citizens' needs, fostering a democratic culture that genuinely serves the people. Well, this situation underscores a larger narrative in African politics. Can democracy truly thrive when dissent is met with suppression? To remain authentic to its democratic identity, Nigeria, and by extension, Africa, must find a way to embrace open discourse without resorting to punitive measures that harm public trust.